Let me thank John for inviting me here and thank all of you for attending. He wanted me to briefly introduce myself. I'm Richard Matthew. I'm the director of a research center for unconventional security affairs here at UCI. I'm also a professor. And I have the good fortune of having a couple of other affiliations. I'm a member of the United Nations expert group on environment, conflict, and peace building, and have been able to go on peace building missions in Sierra Leone, Congo, and Rwanda. And I'm a senior fellow at the International Institute for Sustainable Development in Geneva and the Monk School at the University of Toronto. And what I'm going to talk about today is based on a couple of things. I've been working in South Asia for about 15 years, initially in Pakistan, and then during the civil war in Nepal, and most recently in Sri Lanka. So I've spent about 15 years traveling to the area on pretty much an annual basis for field research. I just completed, as part of the National Research Council's group that studied the security implications of glacial melt in this region, a report prepared for the White House, which unfortunately it's confidential, so I can't use that material, but doing the research that informs this presentation. And especially I want to mention the collaboration I have with Jay Famiglietti, who's a professor here. He's the director of the Center for Hydrologic Modeling, and has found some very innovative ways to use satellite imagery to help us understand groundwater change around the world, including in this region. And I'll show a couple of the images that he has developed. So what I want to do in the time that we have is create a context for the talk and then go right into what's happening in this part of the world and why we might be concerned about what's happening in this part of the world. And let me begin by making a few general comments about how we understood security from when I was a student and for most of the last 100 years and so on, at least here in the United States and in the Western world. And it was really thought of as something that had three areas where you had to be concerned. You had to be concerned with ideological rivalry, with communism, fascism, liberalism. You had to be concerned with who had power, and you had to be concerned with the implications of economic competition. And from our perspective, to optimize security, we needed to address those things. We needed to defeat fascism, communism, we needed to have a strong military, and we needed to promote decolonization and trade. And if we did those things, we would be substantially reducing the sources of conflict in the world and creating a platform for an endurable peace. And we thought that the more economic integration we could promote, and the better off, and the less ideological rivalry, the better off the world would be. And we were incredibly successful in the 20th century in pursuing this agenda and in succeeding in the pursuit of this agenda. And so for a lot of people, when the Cold War ended, the major problems of security also ended with it. In fact, people wrote about the end of history. And they said, now we have a world in which we have no longer any ideological rivalry, in which there are no more colonies, in which people are opening up their economies. We will trade and we will prosper together. And there are some very famous things saying, we've turned the corner on history. We no longer have to worry about security. And in fact, an entire debate was triggered in the early 1990s about whether or not security was something that we had to be concerned with anymore. Could we, in fact, take our security spending, however that was, and move it into other areas? Was there going to be an enormous post-Cold War peace dividend? And some people were very aggressive. They said, all the big issues have been resolved now. They've finally been resolved, and the rest is going to be tinkering. There'll be borders to be renegotiated, and there'll be pockets of extremism to sort of contain. But on the whole, we're no longer in danger of world war or of this type of problem. And so there were many people who were optimistic. Other people, however, looked at the situation and said, well, unfortunately, in the solution, we also have the seeds of a new generation of challenges. And so people were not saying that free trade was not good, economic openness was not good, decolonization was not good, but what they did say was that these solutions to the problem of great power war, came with a new set of problems. And so in the 1990s, people tried to get a handle on what these problems were. What were going to be the security challenges for the next century? And I was fortunate. I was actually sort of, that's when I finished my PhD, and I was part of that group of people who tried to figure out what would security look like in the years ahead, in the post-Cold War world. And all sorts of things came up. There was going to be, people said, well, economic openness introduces a greater possibility for transnational crime. And they said, and in an integrated world is a world in which disease will be able to flourish on scales that are unprecedented. And those people who aren't happy with the status quo, who aren't happy with the post-Cold War world order, have much more capacity to do damage than they did in any other generation. One of the things that happened in the early 1990s, which was very influential, was the Rio conference. And Rio Plus 20 just finished in June. It was not quite as exciting as it was in 1992, when many of us felt that a whole new agenda had been created for the planet, an agenda built around the concept of sustainability, of sustainable relations with each other, with the environment, fair relationships which made sense economically and which made sense ecologically. And so there was a sort of excitement around the notion of Rio. But part of the reason for Rio was because underlying it was this growing body of science evidence which suggested that maybe the great threat to the world was not the possibility of a World War III, but the possibility of ecological collapse, of systems coming down because our integrated, global, high-paced economy was using up resources in ways which were not sustainable and which were creating all sorts of stresses in different parts of the world. So the reason sustainability made sense was in part because of this growing scientific awareness that we were using up forests and we were using up fisheries and we were releasing greenhouse gases and we were reducing biodiversity around the planet. Now, it turns out that understanding the relationship between biodiversity loss and climate change and water stress and security is not a very easy thing to do, because you're dealing with two very complex worlds. Social systems are very complex. Yes, they do break down. We have all sorts of examples of systems breaking down, but they're also very adaptive, very innovative, very resilient, very powerful. And ecological systems break down. But they're also resilient and adaptive and tremendously robust. So figuring out the relationship between these and what's an optimal relationship and what is a relationship that we should worry about is not straightforward. It seemed straightforward 20 years ago, but as the evidence piled in, we realized it's really a very complex issue. But people grappled with it in a number of ways. They said, well, maybe the environment can be a contribution to conflict and insecurity, just in the way that we thought of ideology and economic competition contributing to these things. And they looked at what was happening in the post-Cold War world, and they said, yeah, there's land scarcity in Rwanda, and there's competition over diamonds in Sierra Leone, and there's competition over strategic minerals in Congo, and over land in Congo. And these are key parts of a new generation of violence which we're seeing. And it isn't that this didn't happen before. It was happening on a larger scale, more intrusively, more quickly than ever before. Technologies made it possible to do things on scales that were unimaginable 100 years earlier. And with more people, more ability to transform the environment, it was potentially more people being sideswiped by this, more people aggrieved by this, more people willing to fight for diamonds, water, land, what have you. And we looked and we said, and when you've got water stress and energy stress and land stress, it can overwhelm your government. And we looked and said, that could explain what's happening in Nepal. The civil war in Nepal, there's just too many people, not enough land. They have no place to go. They have no way, you can't have an agricultural economy of 30 million people with a land base that will support maybe 4 or 5 million people. So they said, what can Nepal do? It cannot, it's simply falling apart in the way that countries fell apart in medieval Europe, what we call feudal anarchy. There just wasn't enough land to go around for the number of people. They looked at how if your environment is faring badly, it might affect national power. They looked at the collapse of the Soviet Union and said, well, you know, its ecological legacy was so toxic, so destructive, that this was actually a tremendous burden on its power. And part of the reason why it started to erode and fall apart in the 80s and 90s was because its environment was in such disorder. And the Soviet Union emerged as the only country in the world where life expectancy started to decline rapidly from, as far as we can tell, lifestyle and ecological variables. People looked at the military footprints and said, you know, the cost of security is extremely high. These bases around the world and the way militaries interact with the environment is actually very destructive. They use the U.S. Department of Defense, for example, contributes about 5% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions. Think of that. 5% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions from one organization in one country. So yes, they took an enormous toll being ready to fight the next war. And at the same time, the UN introduced the concept of human security and said, and most people in any case never were at risk of being killed in war. That was always a really small percentage. Most people are at risk of untimely deaths because of poverty, because of disease, because of these sorts of things. And environmental change places a burden on them, on their ability to survive. So people looked at that and they said there are some relationships. It's not easy to study these, but there are probably some relationships. And there are also relationships between the environment and violent conflict itself. We look at countries like Sierra Leone and we say, you know, the competition for diamonds was not the only motivator of that conflict. No doubt about it. There were all sorts of things going on. But under conditions of war, the normal routine behaviors, routine ways of operating are in suspension, and people can profiteer under conditions of war. So we found a whole lot of people suddenly found that war was actually a convenient time for them to become wealthy, that they could use war as long as they could keep the government from functioning effectively, they could go in and exploit it in ways that they could not exploit under routine conditions. So some people had an interest in war. They could use it to fund further war. They could use it to enrich themselves. And many people became rich in this new generation of post-Cold War world wars because they were able to exploit the environment in novel and let's say, you know, damaging ways. And of course, things get damaged during the war. And people also ask the question about what about in the post-conflict phase? How relevant is the environment and natural resources during that phase? And they said, well, you know, actually, if it's relevant in the earlier two phases, then it's definitely relevant to building the peace. And even if it's not, even if it wasn't a contributor to that conflict, even if it wasn't responsible for it, it's still going to be important when you have to, in the case of Rwanda, for example, resettle 2 million people. In August 1994, Rwanda found itself in the precarious position of having to resettle not only 1 million people who had been displaced during the genocide, but 1 million people who were returning to the country, who had been living out of the country for a decade because of the constant war. And they had no place to go. There's a small sort of land-scarce country. And so they put them in swamps, and they put them in protected areas, and they put them on the steep hillsides of the country. And 10 years later, the country experienced massive soil erosion and flooding problems and constant displacement problems because they had to settle so many people so quickly, and they didn't have a plan to do that. It also turns out in countries like Sierra Leone, whether you think diamonds were a cause of the war or a support of the war, they were certainly an element that was important in the post-war period. I worked actually on the diamond industry in Sierra Leone, and it became very clear that this was going to be a major factor in whether the people just chose to trust the government, how they saw the government handling the minerals in that country. And if they saw the government handling them fairly, that would be very important. And if they didn't think that it was fair, then the ability to build trust among people coming out of a 10-year war was going to be very, very difficult. So it was important for the government to immediately ask the question, how do we reform the minerals industry, the mining industry, and make people who are seeing it restored after the war, who are seeing it take shape again, feel that they're getting the benefits that are fair and reasonable, and that they're not being exploited in the post-war period. And we know that many people did not feel that way. And what they did was they said, this is unfair, we're being exploited. In Sierra Leone, it was a difficult situation because the government had given diamond concessions and mining concessions to paramilitary groups to help it fight the war. So in the post-Cold War, post-war period, they felt they faced a very difficult situation. And renegotiating those concessions and trying to get people to have faith in how the government was handling the gold and the diamonds and the lead in the country was critical to the ability of the government to build trust, to rekindle trust that had disappeared. Now, in recent years, a lot of focus has been given to the issue of climate change. And the general sentiment is that climate change, whatever one believes is the relationship between natural resources, the environment, and security and conflict in the past, is going to be amplified by climate change. Climate change is going to make, if there was competition for water or competition for land in the past, it's going to worsen as climate change intensifies. Not everybody agrees with that. But people do agree that it's more likely to complicate things like peace building and introduce new levels of problem, double exposure, when a country is faced not only with the possibility of social breakdown, of a government that is collapsing under conflict, but also an environmental disaster at the same time. So you get and we see this, that in every case, every peace building case that the UN has been involved in, has also been the site, almost at the same time, of a major natural disaster. So there's a tendency for natural disasters and social calamities to go hand in hand. And it makes perfect sense when you think of it. The government is not prepared to respond effectively, so the natural disasters quickly spiral out of control when you have generalized turbulence and instability in your country. It makes sense, but it becomes very, very difficult to manage when you've got, flooding or drought on the one hand and a government that's not functioning because it's engaged in civil war on the other hand. Then the people are, as we say, exposed to a double burden. And those people can easily lose tremendous amount of their sense of optimism and purpose and having a viable future when they see on the one side the social system collapse or betray them, and on the other side their traditional livelihoods start to collapse under the weight of natural disaster or environmental stress. And of course some people argue that as the environment changes we become more vulnerable to those 1 in a million events which trigger other events, the black swan events, the things that nobody expected to happen under reasonable conditions suddenly happen, and you get you get complex types of disasters. Now, there are critics, and today we see, there's some people who just don't like to use the word security and conflict in relationship to the environment. They just think that's dangerous. You don't know, the language of security and conflict carries so much baggage with it. People don't want that relationship. Some people don't want that relationship. They think that we should keep it in the realm of development, for example, or keep it in the realm of human rights. And that's a rhetorical argument. It's a political strategy. It is not a research-based argument, but it's an argument that we'd rather see an association between justice, environment, rights, and development than between conflict, insecurity, and so on. And I can understand that type of concern. Other people say, look, we create a concern and a set of alarms that as our environment changes, we're going to see more conflict, when really a lot of environmental stress triggers cooperation and ingenuity. And there's no doubt that's true. Historically, if we look back, we see that under conditions of environmental stress, people often come up with interesting innovations to solve the problem. And there's no reason to believe that won't happen often in the years ahead. In fact, some people believe that 50 years from now will be the best of times, when people will be better off globally than ever before. A new book has just come up making that argument. At the same time, when we look at what's been happening the past decade or two, we see an awful lot of drought and food shortages and famine and new zoonotic diseases and so on. So we have some reasonable reasons to worry about human and national security under conditions of environmental stress. But, and I've said it once and I'll repeat it, there's lots of uncertainty. So against that background, let me make a few comments about what's happening in the region that I've been working on recently. It's a big region, 2,000 kilometers squared, and it includes, you know, I won't bother to read them, but those countries, and right away you see, you know, countries where there's been a history of violence and instability. Afghanistan has been in a condition of conflict for decades. Bangladesh has been you know, fighting poverty and a military government and natural disaster. Nepal has been in a civil war, which even though it's formally ended, it still hasn't got a constitution, still doesn't have a functioning government, still is in a period of instability and chaos. If you go to Kathmandu today, 3.5 million people living in a city designed for about 1 million. You have endless chronic water shortages, energy shortages. There's almost no waste management at all. It's a tremendously bleak situation. In fact, most of the Maoists are still incarcerated or being held. They have not yet been reintegrated into society 3 years after the peace treaty. It's a tense, tough situation that could sort of collapse back into civil war at any time. In fact, I think there's a particularly high amount of pessimism in the past few months about Nepal. Pakistan, of course, has always been a turbulent country and continues to demonstrate that turbulence. So you've got a bunch of turbulent countries socially, politically. It's also the source of these important river systems that provide water to about 3 billion people. So think of that. Almost 1/2 of the world's population in some way depends upon water from this little tiny region. And because these are agricultural economies, the dependency on water is an extremely important dependency. So you've got an awful lot of people relying on water that is sourced in this turbulent area. And in an area where we know we're experiencing glacial melt. Now the glacial melt seems to be roughly what we're seeing in other parts of the world, which means that at lower elevations, glaciers that aren't covered with debris are particularly, and are small, tend to be very vulnerable and are melting faster than they should be. At higher elevations, larger glaciers do not seem to be so problematic. Snow melt seems to be decreasing overall in the area, but the area is a complicated area. It's a highly mountainous area. One part of it its weather is largely shaped by the summer monsoons, and the other part is largely shaped by the tropical westerlies in the winter. So you have this region with two very, very distinct but interrelated climate systems. It's very mountainous. It's hard to collect data, and it's misleading to average data over this region because you know, you're talking about a lot of altitude change and so on. Nonetheless, there appears to be significant glacial melt and significant snow melt, and those appear to be about 15% of all the fresh water. So, and they're particularly important at certain times of the year. And in fact, the agricultural and fishing industries are largely built around the monsoon, the arrival of the monsoon, or the seasonal melt of snow and ice. So if that changes, then it upsets the broader economy in significant ways. You can also see that because this water travels through a bunch of countries that have not historically got along very well, there's lots of opportunity for blaming and for suspicion as things change. And it's hard to say, you know, this is a shared problem that we all have to face together versus this is a problem caused by you misusing water or what have you, or diverting it away from us. So you get a lot of suspicion, a lot of distrust, a lot of people who aren't quite clear what's happening, but they know what's happening. We also know that the intensity and timing of the monsoon is changing. So it is migrating away from its historical patterns, which creates enormous stress for the economy, which has largely been built upon the regularity of the monsoon rains. And then we have what appears to be massive groundwater overdraft in India and Pakistan. Enormous. In fact, both India and Pakistan appear to be taking out the maximum amount of water possible to take out, so it can no longer be replenished. And that bodes very poorly because, you know, these are the major sources of water in the region, and each one of them is under stress, and we're talking about 3 billion people. And at 3 billion and growing. So you have very rapid population growth. Population momentum will continue to increase the populations of India and Bangladesh and China, regardless of other policies. Afghanistan is the only country that's growing very quickly naturally, but the other ones are growing through population momentum and will add hundreds of millions of more people over the next 50 years. So, and also, and a source of tremendous turbulence, the historic agricultural economy is slowly moving away towards a more service-based economy, especially in India, and a more manufacturing type of economy in pockets of the region. Even countries that people think of here as sort of locked into a traditional economy like Bangladesh are actually transforming very quickly. It is true that Africa may be the most dynamic part of the global economy today, but this is a much larger part of the global economy, and elements of it are performing extremely well. Bangladesh is growing at 8% a year. In fact, Bangladesh believes that by 2020 it will be a middle-class country if it can sustain its current growth rate. The problem is that growth rate requires lots of water and energy, and is offset a little bit by the rapidly growing population. So you've got a lot of challenges, a lot of things going on in this region. The IPCC reports, and the next report, which comes out in 2014, and we've already seen drafts of it and seen beginnings of it, is going to say that these situations are considerably worse than they reported in 2007. So the general tenor of the 2007 report was that this is a volatile area from the perspective of climate change and therefore water, because climate change is largely about the redistribution of water. In 2007, people already said that South Asia is warming up more rapidly than the rest of the world and is going to face considerable water problems. Glacier Lake outburst floods in Bhutan and Nepal, but very, very intense droughts or very, very intense flooding in Pakistan and Bangladesh and India and parts of China and so on. So 2014, what we expect is that they will say it's much worse than we thought. So we're not likely to see a report in 2014 that says there's some good news in South Asia. The water situation isn't quite as bad as we thought. We're likely to see a report that says this is much more serious. And in fact, I think the general tenor of the climate science community is that we are in deep, deep trouble as they look through the latest round of findings. And the research on climate change, it doubles every 18 months or something like this. So even by the time the report is out, by the time it's edited, finalized, until it gets out, the knowledge of the issue has already improved by 100%. So reports are already out of date in a sense, but what we're seeing right now, which is sort of up to date, is that the water challenges in this region are significant. And if you look, you can see, here's a very famous map showing how South Asia is going to be experiencing both greater droughts and greater flooding in different parts of it. If we look at here's some imagery from Professor Famiglietti showing that and I should stress that we don't really understand very well how surface waters, that is monsoon, snow, and glacial waters, interact with groundwaters. We don't understand that in California, we don't understand that in Saskatchewan, we don't understand that in South Asia. That's a complex issue. But what it appears to us is that water is disappearing. Now, groundwater includes fossil water, which once it's used up, it's gone forever. It was stored there. That's a natural storage area. So groundwater is stored water, like glaciers. And once you use it, it moves into the hydrological system, and there's no guarantee it's going to replenish your area. No, it moves off into the ocean, it moves off somewhere else, but it's gone from your area. Groundwater that can be recharged, usually from stream flow of some sort of rainfall, as far as we can tell, is not recharging. So what it looks like that there's a massive overdraft throughout much of South Asia. And when we look at each of the river systems, the trends on almost all of them are downward over a fairly, this is over a decade. And those are alarming trends. Those are not trends you want to see. In a country like Pakistan, 60% of irrigation water comes from groundwater. So as groundwater declines and population increases, you have really no easy solution to that situation. You have only the prospect of food shortages and people losing their livelihoods and people being displaced. But where will they be displaced to? If you're in Pakistan, you can't easily go to India. Afghanistan doesn't offer a lot. You can move down to Karachi or something like this, but there isn't a lot of economic activity there. So you've got the prospects of large numbers of people being uprooted from their traditional livelihoods and not having any easy solution. And as water stress intensifies, we could see this intensify. These graphs are really, in a way, deeply, deeply alarming. Now, as I said, there's lots we don't know. We don't understand surface groundwater very well. We don't understand how people are going to adapt. We do know that a lot of these extrapolations are based on the assumption that people aren't going to change, and they are going to change. They're going to change their behavior. They're going to become more efficient. They're going to do things differently. So there's always some good news. But there's always a race between the capacity of humans and markets and governments to adapt to stresses and the pace at which those stresses are growing. And the big fear here is that the stresses are exceeding the adaptive capacity of governments, people, and markets. And consequently, as that gap gets larger and larger, the potential for breakdowns, whether they're droughts or food shortages or famines or whatever, grows higher and higher. So you don't want your stresses to be growing so quickly that your adaptive mechanisms, your stock of ingenuity can't be applied to those problems fast enough to avoid really, really horrifying things. And that's one big concern, is that the rates are not in balance. Our ability to supply innovation and ingenuity where it's needed, when it's needed, is being outstripped by the scale of these problems and by the uncertainties that surround them. And this means that the big concern is that this part of the world, servicing 3 billion people, is likely to experience considerable water stress. And that water stress could translate into development setbacks, massive displacements of population, huge health. One of the people I work with was the former director of Doctors Without Borders, James Urbinski, and one of his big areas of concern is that after making enormous gains globally in public health, we are now poised to see huge public health setbacks in the years ahead. So after all that investment, motivated by things like our concern for HIV/AIDS and stuff, which brought people medication and education, better hygiene, and better infrastructure, this could all be offset by drought and water shortages and these types of problems and heat waves and so on. So we could start to see a lot of the gains of the past 30 or 40 years rolled back, and we could start to see things that seem to be moving forward suddenly stop and fizzle out. Is it guaranteed? Not at all. This, however, is sort of the worst case scenario. And when you look at the context in which water stress is going to play out, you can see why many people are concerned about this. You have an area which is going to add an enormous number of people, 1.6 billion over the next 40 years. It's also urbanizing more rapidly on a scale for which there is no historical precedent. We have never seen billions of people move from agricultural to urban lifestyles in such a short pace of time. We don't even know how we will build the urban infrastructure to accommodate 1.6 or 2 billion people. We have no idea where that will come from. And the big fear is that the movement into urban areas will exceed the capacity to build robust infrastructure. And so you'll have a sort of a poorly set up shanty towns with energy grids and water systems and road networks that are just too vulnerable to stress, that cannot really sustain the work that they need to do. We know how difficult, we know the beauty of infrastructure investment. It seems to alleviate poverty, it creates conditions for economic prosperity, but right now very little investment is being made into infrastructure in this region. So in fact, there's very little investment globally in infrastructure at all, even though all of our historical information, or let's say, I'll never say all, but a considerable amount of historical information suggests to us that infrastructure investment is a wise choice. we're seeing it decline almost everywhere on the planet, including in our own country. So just that when we need to reinvest in water systems and transportation systems and so on, we're pulling back investment. And they are becoming, therefore, in a sense, more sensitive to climate and other types of environmental stress. We have an area that's growing quickly, and because it's growing quickly, you have a lot of people who want to get water and energy quickly to sustain that growth. This is the world of overnight millionaires. I was in India a few months ago, and same is the case of Bangladesh. And you can feel that in entrepreneurial spirit there. All sorts of people excited about the future, and they should be excited about the future. They're making some dramatic changes. But one of the questions, of course, is how is that future, how is that growth going to be resourced over the next 20 or 30 years? Will it be resourced in a way which is sustainable, or in a way which is going to cause problems down the road? And one of the obvious things is the incredible growth in energy needs that we predict. Already, the focus of the energy debate has shifted away from us and towards Asia. And it looks like in the years ahead, more and more, the future of global energy is going to be determined. And this has all sorts of implications as it changes the prices of energy and makes it difficult, maybe perhaps for poorer countries in places like Africa to obtain the energy they need to deal with the drought and flooding and food issues that they have. So as energy prices go up and energy moves into certain parts of the world, it puts stress on other parts of the world as well. Every year, an index of failed states. It's a terrible term in some ways. But what it basically tries to do is measure a number of things which suggest the well-being, the health and well-being and effectiveness of your government structure. And every year, countries in South Asia are at the very top of this list. So yes, there are a number of African countries, but Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Nepal are all considered countries where it's difficult to get the government to solve big problems like this. This is not, it's the forte of those governments. India is sort of, well, let's say there's a big debate over how effectively India can mobilize its governance capacity, and whether it will be able to provide leadership in this region over the next 20 or 30 years on climate change, on energy, on food, on population displacement. And there's many reasons to be optimistic, but we also have to remember that India, unlike, say, China, which was able to pacify all of its bordering countries through one measure or another, India has problematic relationships with each of its bordering countries, not just Pakistan, but with all of them. And so its ability to sort of take control of this region and look at it and say, here's how we're going to attack water, here's how we're going to deal with energy, here's how we're going to deal with climate. Its ability is let's say, unclear. Nobody knows for sure whether India will be that force or whether India will not be that force. But we do know that there's lots of reasons to seek some leadership on these issues in that region. So when we look at this region from the perspective of what I talked about earlier, environmental security, I want to be very cautious and say we don't want to, to just sort of say, well, there's going to be glacial melt, therefore floods, therefore water scarcity, therefore people will be displaced and there'll be conflict, is too simplistic. Too much happens. Too much happens. And in many ways, so much is already happening that's unsettling and destabilizing in the region that it's hard to say water stress is going to be the variable that really, really determines the future. There's lots of reasons to think it is because it's so important and because the change seems so dramatic. But we also know that this is a turbulent region in a lot of, in lots of ways. And as a result, people are not yet sure. And the current state of thinking in the scientific community is we don't know whether water stress will tend to be sort of a weaker signal because there's so many other problematic things going on, disease outbreaks and hundreds of millions of desperately poor people and nuclear weapons and all these types of issues, or whether it'll be the issue that really starts to push some of these systems over a critical threshold so that start to collapse and can't recover and can't provide food and can't provide water, can't provide the basic needs for hundreds and hundreds of millions of people. Nobody knows. And what I think we can expect is that water stress the impact of water stress is going to vary from one part of that region to another. It's not going to be uniform. Anybody who sort of says, this is what's going to happen throughout South Asia, this is how 3 billion people are going to be affected over the next 20 years, that's on the very speculative side of research. But I think what we can say with some confidence is that some people are going to be egregiously affected by water shortages or flooding in the years ahead. Egregiously. That they are going to have a very, very difficult time surviving under the scale of these stresses. And these stresses have the potential to spiral out of control, to be that force. Already we see, for example, terrorists saying that one of their motivations in the region is that water is being used unfairly by India, and India is saying that's not true. We're abiding by the terms of this agreement, and the government is saying, and they're saying to the government of Pakistan, get your terrorists under control. And the government of Pakistan is saying, we can't get them under control, but we need to renegotiate the agreements. And so you get this complicated thing where they're saying, we're not going to renegotiate until you deal with the security issue, and they're saying, well, we can't, but we need to renegotiate because it's driving the security issue. Our inability to renegotiate in a transparent way is fueling some of this anger and this violence. So we can easily imagine that in the worst case scenario, where innovation and adaptation and cooperation and sharing of science data and working together to manage the water problems doesn't take place, we can see water stress contributing to violent conflict. We can see it linked to a collapse of traditional livelihoods. We can see, as even in some cases, like the Maldives, the country disappearing entirely. Right now, it looks like sea level rise could seal the fate of that country over the next 50 years or so. We can see all sorts of problems like food shortages. We can see the emergence and the spreading of tropical diseases to new areas and the emergence of new diseases as humans come into contact with ecosystems where they previously did not live. We can see, and some people are predicting, massive increases in malnutrition, huge numbers. I think this particular number, which comes from the British economist Nicholas Stern, is largely considered a back-of-the-envelope number, which doesn't have much credibility. But the idea behind it, that water, flooding, and drought move people out of those regions, the idea behind it is sound, even if the number probably is meaningless. We can see obstacles to development. We can see all these things if the trends in groundwater, snow melt, ice melt, and the monsoon continue along their current trajectory without more robust institutional and technological solutions being delivered. So, and the opportunity for disaster is probably sort of over the next 10 to 20 years. So the need to deliver robust institutional and technological solutions is we have a very short time frame for delivering those. We're already seeing disasters spiral up, and Bangladesh, Pakistan, India, and China, all of them in this Hindu Kush Himalaya region are 4 of the top 12 countries in terms of their sensitivity to natural disaster. So the bulk of the world's natural disasters are taking place in this part of the world, and the bulk of them are hydrological disasters. And of course, it'll also affect the environment. And so I want to just close by showing you some slides from one of my field trips, and this one was to northern Pakistan. And if you look at it, because sometimes it's hard to visualize what are the sort of on-the-ground conditions which are going to experience massive water stress? What happens? What does it mean if northern Pakistan is flooded, or if there's a massive drought in this part of the world? Well, we have to take a look at what the place looks like. So this is the only road leading from Peshawar and Islamabad up to China. This is the only road. So everything moves along this road. And the movement along this road is so slow that people actually walk beside the trucks as they move up this strip of road. And this road is closed for much of the year. But take a look at how it's built into this into this region of young mountains. It's precarious. This is a road which, you know, is vulnerable to erosion, and it's easily eroded. Here, you know, here's an area where as I'm driving along, we had a Toyota Land Cruiser, and my driver said, you know, this part it looks particularly. You get out of the car, because I'm not sure that I can make it around here, and if we tumble over, the car goes off the road, then there's no way to stop it. It's just going to roll down for 1,000 feet, and so no point in both of us going down. And you know, you look at it and you say, wow, you can see what flooding can do to the sole artery which connects northern Pakistan and Afghanistan, and hence the Middle East, down into the heart of South Asia. You see the communities that have lived there, literally some of the oldest communities, because along these river systems, we know that some of the oldest communities along the Indus and river system and so on, you see these very, very old communities, and behind them you see that the barriers which might protect you from things like flooding and drought have largely been decimated. Our calculation was that 95% of original forest cover is gone. So it's no longer exists, and it's very hard to replant on those steep hillsides. And that means these people who have been living here for literally centuries suddenly find themselves in a world in which this can all disappear overnight. Overnight, and in fact it does. These villages, these little settlements get hit by a flood, they get hit by a mudslide, and they're gone after centuries of existence. And the scale of the disasters are you know, of sort of historic proportions. I'm sure everybody remembers the massive floods that took place just 2 years ago and displaced 21 million people. You know, look at some of the numbers here. But this is not a sort of once in a century event. This is now becoming a sort of routine type of event. These massive water-related crises which move people and undermine their livelihoods and put a huge stress on the government and channel funds away from development and infrastructure to emergency response and do all these things are becoming more and more routine events. And that's alarming, especially in countries that don't have a lot of funds to invest in education and invest in roads and invest in energy. If those funds are being moved into disaster response more and more often, then you get into this potential cycle of despair, which is very hard to imagine how we would get out of it. And consequently, a number of very famous people have said, you know, the end is here. And in fact, there's a whole cascade of books that say that it is over the next 20 years that the world is going to start to collapse. And it's going to start to collapse in those regions where you have the most people, South Asia and Africa. But that collapse is going to be possibly global in scale. And so, you know, E.O. Wilson, the Harvard biologist, says we're on the verge of the 6th great extinction. The other extinctions caused by asteroid strikes and massive volcanic activity and so on. Huge dust storms which block the sun for decades and decades. But we're on our way to that through our misuse of things like water. We are creating such fragility in our system, such brittleness in our system, by doing things like overusing water and moving it from one place to the other, that you know, we should be thinking about how we're going to survive the next 50 years. Other people think, no, they're much more optimistic, and they say we're going to find ways to adapt and innovate, and we're going to solve these problems. And this is a very optimistic view. Of course, it requires that people actually get together and start doing this. And there are some good signs in both Africa and South Asia of people who are working on these issues in creative and innovative ways and trying to overcome old barriers and think of things anew and so on. And that is, in a sense, the sort of the most stark set of choices. On the one hand, we will fail to solve the problems, the water problems, and we will see agricultural economies and therefore the people go down, or we will find solutions, and things will look really good 20 or 30 years from now. Of course, very likely it'll be something in between. that some people will suffer enormously, and other people will find ways to adapt and to innovate and to succeed. We don't really know. But we do know that that one of the things that makes it difficult for us to plot a course of action today is that there's so much uncertainty about this region. The data gaps are enormous. There's all sorts of things we don't understand. We don't understand how aerosols are going to affect the climate of the region. But we do understand that aerosols, and that's in this region mostly black carbon and desert dust, that those they're changing the albedo effect of the glaciers, of the snow areas. They're changing things, but we don't understand exactly what all that means. So there's huge things that we just don't fully understand. And so one of the things we need to do is continue to invest in research in this area. And that's, some of the research we're doing here on groundwater and looking at trying to understand the relationships between groundwater and surface water and how this is likely to affect especially exposed societies, I think is very important, and that's why it's getting some attention. We need to really deepen the collaboration between, for years, people studying ice and snow were over here, and people studying conflict and peace were over here. And when you bring them together, you create the conditions for breakthroughs, which I think are absolutely impossible when they're apart. So the more we have them apart, as we do on every campus in this country, the more we put a constraint on intellectual breakthroughs that might solve some of these problems. One of the most rewarding experiences of my life was to be on a National Research Council committee, which is a science-based committee, because it's part of the National Academy of Science, with all these snow scientists and glacial scientists and hydrologists, and myself, a social scientist. I learned more about what was happening in this region, talking to these guys for a couple of days, than I would ever have garnered doing research on my own, because they know it so well. And most of them had no clue how to understand the possible social effects of massive water change. They thought they're probably horrible, but so the more we can bring those groups together. We also, one of the great glaring omissions is we don't really have much of a sense of how people who live there are in fact adapting to these stresses. We know they're in the front lines of some of these things, of the monsoon change, of the groundwater shortages, but we haven't really looked very closely at what they're doing to cope. And what we do believe is that probably they're coming up with some very innovative solutions that could be shared or scaled up. We just don't have a process for picking them up yet. We don't have those sort of collaborations. We don't have that systematic inventory of how people are responding there or Africa or anywhere else. And yet it's almost certainly a rich set of data that we need to have. Because only if we do these sorts of things can we sort of plot a set of investments which will maybe start to tip us towards solutions, adaptation, getting through successfully, as opposed to institutional failure and collapse. So I think there's a whole lot of things that we know we can always do. We can certainly invest in development. We can certainly improve things that we know are not faring well, like tube well, groundwater overdrafting and this sort of thing. But there are some other very important things which I think are only in their infancy, and bringing natural and social scientists together, bringing indigenous knowledge into these issues, looking at more carefully at how the whole hydrological system functions and how it interacts with other parts of the environment. These are things which we've got to solve in the next few years if we're going to provide information to policymakers quickly enough to make a difference. Thanks very much.